model in a thanks for the recording. So we are exploring today in this session how to place the FAIR data maturity model in a larger ecosystem, how it can be used to implement FAIR, how can the model and the individual FAIR assessment methods enable culture change around data and software sharing, and what we think is missing. We know that as we have assessments, as we move forward with the broad community, becoming more aware and engaged with concepts around FAIR and all of the relevant other elements, that there is more thought that needs to go into a model to help support that. So that's what we are hoping for this conversation today. And we're going to start with Keith Russell. So Keith is my co-chair on this particular working group, but Keith has also been instrumental within the ARDC to work on elements and bring concepts around FAIR to the community. And Keith, if you could get your slides queued up and talk to what's happening within the ARDC.
There we are. So you should now be able to see my slides. Yeah. Okay. Oh, and first of all, big welcome also from me, and an acknowledgement of country. As I sit on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. So welcome to this session. Also on behalf of Edith Herzog, she's the third co-chair of this working group. Sadly, she couldn't make this session. So Shelley and I will be doing this session. But now to kick things off, I thought I'd just provide a little bit of perspective from down under, from Australia, about what we've learned in doing FAIR evaluation. So first of all, a little bit of background. The Australian Research Data Commons is a national organisation funded by the Commonwealth, funded by the government, to provide Australian researchers with competitive advantage through data. So we are a research infrastructure organisation. We're funded as a national research infrastructure organisation and work together with a whole bunch of other research infrastructure organisations. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on in the discussion. So we care a lot about and making sure that Australian researchers have access to data and can use data in the most efficient and effective way. And as we've been doing that, FAIR came up, and we've been looking at FAIR over several years. And it's been quite a big thing for us. So as we were trying to guide partners through FAIR, early on, we set up a very simple self-assessment tool on our website, which is just a form in which people could fill in different fields and sort of self-assess how fair their data set was, and what changes, if they made changes to that, what that would do and how that would increase the fairness of their data set. This was very much targeted at those that support researchers, and it was a very simple first crack at this. As this was developed and set up, we realized that it actually met a need, and people were very happy with this because it made it quite understandable and easy, sort of in a click-through way. But we were also starting to get feedback, and people saying, well, actually, can you give me a hard score? Can you give me a number? That was one piece of feedback. Another feedback we got a lot was, can we store this somewhere? Because we want to see progress, and we want to see how we are making progress in this regard. Another aspect, one other question we got quite a lot was, well, it's great, this looks at it from a perspective of a data set, but what actually do I need to do to get there? What changes do I need to make in my organization? Or what does it mean for my project? So we started to realize that we needed more than just this one self-assessment tool. And it's resulted in a few spin-offs and a few other templates and that we use in different activities. So one of those is a very simple self-assessment template. All it is a spreadsheet, which but people can store that and can save that, and can also put in different markers in over time as they're working through their FAIR self-assessment. Another a spin-off that came out of this was as we were developing a number of co-investment partnerships with partners, there was a question, well, what does it mean in our project, and how can we, what are the expectations from ARDC around the fairness of the data we create in our projects? So that resulted in a set of project requirements around ARDC, for ARDC co-investment projects, very much tailored to an Australian landscape, thinking about Australian context and Australian tools that are out there and infrastructure that people can use. One further spin-off, and this is the one I'll probably spend a little bit more time talking about, was a discussion with our fellow research infrastructure facilities in Australia. And there's a range of these, and they play quite different roles in the research landscape and in the research process. So what these research infrastructure facilities do is they help researchers to create data, and then in some cases they actually help them publish it, but in other cases they just hand it over to the researchers. So we were trying to figure out what was going to be a useful tool for them to work through what FAIR meant for them. And we developed a set of workshops consisting of a day one and a day two. The first day, or half day really, is sticking very close to the principles, is saying, well, how would you self-assess against the FAIR principles? But we set it up in such a way that you can see here that it's very much a self-assessment. They put on the post-its and see where they're at, but we wanted them to be able to put a different point in time, so they could self-assess where they are now, but also where they want to be, and maybe in the longer term. Again, those questions were very close to the FAIR principles and very close to what a data set should look like. But what we then did is we let them go away and think about it and digest all the stuff that came up to them, and all the stuff that they had to think about in this workshop. And usually about 2 weeks later, we do a follow-up workshop, and you say, well, okay, we've just discussed what FAIR means for your data set. What does it mean for your organization to get to make these changes? So there we broke down the questions according to a number of headings like policy, procedures, infrastructure standards, training, etc. And say, well, what changes do you need to make that relate to this and make this happen? And there again, giving them a chance to talk about it over different points in time. So, and we had to create different subsets of these questions for the different research infrastructure facilities, because they actually play different roles in the data lifecycle. Some of them only create data and then hand it over. Some actually guide researchers through the process and help publish the data. So they do different things. And the further complexity is that some of these are centralized research infrastructure facilities, but some of these actually consist of a whole bunch of nodes which have different practices. So tailoring the workshop to allow for that. So just summarizing, I think probably the lessons we've learned and what we've learned over the years looking at FAIR and evaluating FAIR is that it helps to, rather than just say, these are the FAIR principles, good luck, go for it. We say, well, it actually helps to workshop it with them and talk through what this means and answer any questions and unpack what the FAIR principles are, because often there's not such a great understanding of the detail behind the principles. Very helpful to not see it as just one point in time, but to use it as a voyage, mapping ambitions over several years and saying, well, where are you now? Where do you want to be in 2 years' time? Where would you want to be in 5 years' time? So that they can also identify what are the key priorities they want to pick off first, and what are the more complicated, larger pieces of work that they want to pick off. And because you're talking about doing this over time, it's nice to be able to store these self-evaluations and be able to revisit them and go back to them and say, well, how far did you get in that process? Yeah, again, the organizations we deal with play different roles. So you need to have different evaluations that are relevant to those types of organization and the role they play in that process. And I think one of the final point really, it's all very well to discuss this desired end goal and where you want to be. And yes, your data set should be fair with these characteristics, but actually that requires changes. And how do you enable those changes in the organization? And how can you, taking it one step further is saying, well, okay, it's great. You want maybe persistent identifiers, But if you want persistent identifiers, what does that mean? Does that mean that means changes to your policies? That means changes to procedures. It might mean changes to your infrastructure. It may even mean changes to your researcher training or your user agreements. So you need to work all that through in the whole process. Anyway, so that's a quick overview of ARDC and doing evaluations with some of our partners over the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I really appreciate that. And it's a really great segue into the work that's happening at the USGS. Fran Lightsome is an oceanographer, and she's been leading this fair roadmap for a US agency. And just check. There you are. Hi, Fran. If you want to go ahead and bring your slides up. So this has been something that has been in the works for a couple of years. And as Keith was talking about, you can work with one particular community within a vast set of stakeholders, but you really do need everyone to work together to implement the policies and practices needed for fair data, good data management, good data stewardship. And I think Fran will talk to that challenge as it's applied to the very large community of the U.S. Geological Survey. Did I cue you up, Fran?
That's good. Can you hear me?
All right. Yes, I can hear you and see you. Carry on. Thank you.
Wow, this is great. So Viv Hutchison and I are co-leading this project in the U.S. Geological Survey to develop a fair roadmap for USGS. We are very grateful to our project team, including Shelley, I'd like to point out, and to the USGS Community for Data Integration, which supported our project. The USGS Fair Roadmap team has been working during the same period when the RDA Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group was active. So it's one of those things that happen all at once. There we go. USGS is a diverse natural science organization. Our data and employees span multiple scientific disciplines, including geography, ecosystems, satellite observations, geology, geophysics, hydrology, and oceanography. And our science informs the decisions of probably a wider variety of professions. Internally, our organization is diverse too. On one organizational level are the program management functions that support repositories and data systems. Down a couple of levels and in a different supervisory chain are hundreds of research projects that produce and publish data. These data producing projects are managed locally in science centers distributed across the United States. The focus of the USGS Fair Roadmap is identifying actions that will enable all these different groups to consistently offer research products that are better aligned with the FAIR principles. The roadmap recommends many activities that could be undertaken by 4 areas of USGS that especially tend to unify our data management. The fundamental science practices is a framework of philosophy, policy, and procedures for consistent data quality. The Community for Data Integration is a community of practice that attracts employees from across USGS to grow knowledge and capacity for managing scientific information. The Science Analytics and Synthesis Program provides data management tools and services that are used broadly across USGS. And the Science Data Catalog is a unified source of publicly available metadata with persistent links to data, which motivates consistency with its operational standards. And the catalog will be the first place to check when we evaluate USGS fair data maturity. The current status of USGS alignment with the FAIR principles has mostly resulted from recent federal policies and laws. Compliance with these requirements increased consistency across USGS with modern practices of scientific data management, public release of data in machine-readable, non-proprietary formats, metadata records in standard machine readable formats, trusted digital repositories to maintain and share data, persistent identifiers to ensure long-term discoverability, and the USGS Science Data Catalog. But there are elements of FAIR that are still in need of improvement within USGS, which brings us back to the roadmap. The roadmap is organized into 9 strategies, which are grouped into 3 action areas. Strategies that focus on improvements to individual data products are about metadata, research methods, and persistent identifiers. Strategies that will provide or improve infrastructure are about repositories and data systems, vocabulary services, and policy requirements. Strategies recommending administrative activities are about culture change, and specifically about employee incentives, and about research and development and participation in professional communities. Finally, we get to the RDA Fair Data Maturity Model. Compliance with many of the maturity model indicators is widespread in USGS as a result of policies, the tools that are used widely, and the Science Data Catalog, which provides a service that itself complies with some indicators and requires that metadata comply with others. Metadata has been a USGS strong point for many years. Metadata is also a challenge. We have a large collection of metadata records in the original format developed by the US Federal Geospatial Data Committee, a format which doesn't provide the machine actionable linkages that are possible with the newer ISO standard. Identifiers are another USGS strength. Since 2016, USGS has required data site DOIs for data and ORC IDs for people. Last year, PIDs for metadata records were required by the United States Data.gov catalog and introduced in USGS by the Science Data Catalog. Free access, open access, public access has also been US federal government policy for a long time. But again, we have become committed to systems that were developed before the current expectation that human intervention should not be necessary. Aspects of the FAIR data maturity model that can help USGS implement its FAIR roadmap are the explicit assignment of priorities to the indicators and the assessment details. High priority indicators help communicate the importance of implementing the relevant USGS roadmap recommendations. For example, many of the metadata indicators provide good reasons for USGS to make the change to the ISO metadata standards. The assessment details in the framework could be useful for guiding the actions we take to implement the corresponding roadmap recommendations. The RDA Fair Data Maturity Model has already contributed to the roadmap recommendation that USGS implement a process of evaluating our success in producing data that aligns with FAIR. A new project called State of the Data is testing a custom rubric that combines elements from 6 existing frameworks. In addition to the maturity model, FAIR indicators were selected from Data 1, Go FAIR, and the FAIR metrics group. Other indicators were selected from NOAA's, that's the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have a data stewardship maturity matrix. And there was an artificial intelligence readiness matrix that was developed by the Obama White House. There are also some ways the RDA Fair Data Maturity Model does not match the USGS situation. USGS has a large collection of existing data that was created before FAIR was a thing. In my USGS program, Coastal and Marine Hazards and Resources, by the end of 2020, we had already released more than 5,000 data sets online. These data will need will be needed to understand how the Earth system is changing. Some of it might be used often enough that verification would be cost effective. But for most of it, we need to develop services that achieve the goals of FAIR in other ways. At this point, the USGS assumption is that the data will always be accompanied by its formal metadata record, so that it is not necessary for the data set itself to include information that is in the metadata. So for example, USGS would assume references to other data could be in the associated metadata record instead of in the data file. And there are multiple sources of metadata, not only the formal metadata record, but also the landing page, the persistent identifier record, and possible additional metadata files in other community standards. Which of the metadata sources should we evaluate with the indicators? So in conclusion, thank you to the RDA working group for its work on the FAIR data maturity model, which will be useful in implementing the USGS FAIR data roadmap. And thank you for today's opportunity to see a larger perspective on our USGS work toward FAIR.
And thank you so much. It's so very interesting to see the roadmap in context of the model. I do appreciate that viewpoint because over these last few years, I guess it is few years now, we've been looking at it in so many different angles, and I appreciate the time you took to put it into this particular lens. It's been really quite an effort. Something that has been fascinating is how we take a look at FAIR and what are the other elements for actual implementation. And now it is a good time to actually bring in our roundtable participants. So I will just briefly, if you all could put your cameras on, that would be fantastic. So Andreas Sazerniak from OpenAIRE, and particularly the OpenAIRE validator tool, which is relevant for, hello Andreas, which is relevant for the FAIR data maturity model. Eric Schultes, whom I think most, if not all of you know from the Go FAIR effort, all different aspects. I'm so delighted to see him here. This is really fantastic. Of course, Fran is on our roundtable. And Keith is on our roundtable. Iona Vanstein from the Metrics and Certification Task Force for the EOSC FAIR Working Group. So talk about measuring FAIR. I'm delighted to have her here. And Rob Holt from the DTLS, and also considering all of the tools and efforts and metrics around that. So thank you, Rob, for being here. And then Robert Huber, who has been instrumental in Fuji and the FAIR work, and I am excited about their actual recent publications. We'll have to put a link into that, Robert, for folks. I think that's only a couple weeks old, if that. The tools that have been developed to evaluate FAIR, which were heavily used the model for that work, which we do appreciate. So hello everyone on the roundtable. Welcome to the conversation. And if anybody has a question for the roundtable, please do use the chat and your hand, and we will raise your hand, and we will be happy to pull you into the conversation. So we have a few questions that are prepared. And if anyone has any questions for our speakers as well, let me go check the chat and see if yep, thank you for the Fuji paper. Thank you very much. Let's see. We have some specifics for you, Fran, on ISO. Maybe I'll give you a second to take a look at the chat to get your arms around that. Fran's observation of the format that's being used, and she said the entire name, but I don't ever think I've ever heard the entire name. I've always known it as FDGC. So, but
content standard for digital geospatial metadata.
Thank you, Siri. Yes. That's just me. That's just me. Thank you. But knowing that the ISO standard is more capable, do you want to talk to that a little bit more, Fran?
I was in a meeting this week, about efforts actually finally starting to start using the ISO standard in USGS. Part of the problem is that FGDC is headquartered in USGS. So we have been working with them since the 1990s. And we have this huge batch of metadata that we will need to translate somehow into a modern format. It's starting. We're starting to move, which is always a good thing with USGS.
That is significant, because I do
Okay.
think FGDC was approved by the federal government just recently, which tells you a lot about molasses and politics. It's really good to hear that there's that continued effort to move forward. So that is good news. Cedar, do you
The
want to?
CSDGM was superseded by the North American profile of 19115 10 years ago by some federal decree. I can look up the article where it was stated. But anyway, no, when you said needs to be updated, maybe I misunderstood. I thought you said 19115 needed to be updated, but you're saying FGDC needs to be updated to 19115. That's fine. So
But
we can move
I
on.
mean, the metadata needs to be updated.
The backlog, the back files.
Yeah.
The historical data files that are so critical for all of our analysis. So, which is a no kidding humongous problem.
Yeah.
So, all right, fantastic. Let's see. So the first question up, when we're talking about FAIR, the Fair Data Maturity Model, and you all have navigated and grappled with what it means to do assessment, what it means to affect change within your communities. So I'm reaching out to the broad roundtable, and Andreas, just know I'm going to call on you first. So the question is, when you're thinking about your own tools, or when you're thinking about the model, how would you place that into the larger ecosystem? What does that mean to actually have a model, have your assessment, have your efforts placed broadly within our large research ecosystem?
Yes, hello from Germany. It's an interesting thing. So we are evaluating the FAIR principles in the last year, and OpenAIRE has perspective of the metadata of each repository that are harvested by OpenAIRE. It's a lot of metadata that OpenAIRE have, more than 100 million deduplicated records. And we're supporting our communities with different tools and services. And in this case, we have the opportunity that we have some services like our OpenAIRE validator, and what we come up in our mind, if we analyze the principles, we can use these tools. But we have the challenge that OpenAIRE has not only data. We have a lot of metadata records for articles, software, and so on. So the first challenge was to adapting the FAIR data principles to our guidelines that we have. In this case, the guidelines for institutional and thematic repositories that covers data repositories also, or data records also. And then we come up with some ideas to use the validator that we have for these guidelines in OpenAIRE, and to make an improvement for our repository managers that we have in OpenAIRE. So to present in this case, a lightweight fair assessment for those repositories. And it was a challenge.
So this is something that's planned to do, or you're in the middle of doing?
The first pilots are up and running. So these validator checks the metadata records on this case. So we are in contact also with the FAIR team here, and see what we can do for our communities to support. And we are extending these at the moment to more to our guidelines. So OpenAIRE has guidelines for literature, institutional, thematic data, of course, and also current research information systems, Chris. And
are you finding that by the different types of data that you have in your holdings that you're running into different kinds of problems that might be useful to understand at a broad level, for others to help?
Yes, to identify some gaps or something else in their repositories and or in their institutional repositories, and to improve the FAIR principles on their side. So
yeah, that would be interesting, and maybe something we could come back to in a different type of RDA working group. Like, what as we're applying these assessments, I think there are some understandings by discipline that can propagate internationally. Like Fran, I'm sure there's oceanographers that are challenged by I think like the sea level definition is always a big challenge. What exactly is sea level? Are we, it's not always what you think. Okay. Yeah. All right. Very good. All right. Thank you, Andreas. So Eric, when it comes to, and this is probably for you a 20-day workshop for this question, but when you're applying FAIR to the larger ecosystem, when you're applying assessment, when you're applying models, how should we think about these methodologies in the big research ecosystem?
So Shelley, by methodologies, you mean like the evaluation mechanism?
You can apply this in any way you see fit. Pick a path, and we are with you.
Indeed. So from my, I would say, fortunate point of view that I have from GoFair, which for me is very broad, lots of different stakeholders, lots of different domains, in thinking, I get the chance to really think about cross-disciplinary kinds of, I get mandates to do cross-disciplinary data interoperation. So indeed, we have broad stakeholders to work with, and there is an interest in verification at some level for each of these groups, depending on their own status. And what has emerged in the GoFair community is really this very practical approach, but directly related to, kind of inspired by the early work in FAIR metrics and FAIR maturity indicators, and very much, kind of an extension of the maturity model, where we have essentially the same point of view, but we flip it around, we flip the mandate around a little bit, and we ask not so much about evaluating the fairness of your resource, but rather more actively, given each of the FAIR principles, what are your implementation choices? And that list that you would compose, we call it a FAIR implementation profile. And it's in my mind, it's really the flip side of a fair maturity model, or you could even go to a fair evaluator tool and say, hey, what's being asked for in this tool? What are the tests that are running behind the scenes? And so in a way you could cheat and say, well, whatever they want to measure, that's what I will implement. But I think the good news here is that even by cheating, you're probably increasing your fairness level in some way. So it's just to say we take a more active approach in the Go Fair space, and we put the question very actively to the community. What are your fair implementation choices for identifier systems, for findability metadata schemas and vocabularies, for a technological mechanism that will connect your metadata to your data in some persistent way, for indexing and search, et cetera. Just going through the FAIR principles, you can really ask these questions, and then that generates kind of another round of evaluation. You say, oh, these are my implementations. How do they score? Where can they be improved? Where might I modify my profile to achieve higher interoperability with another group? Something like that. So that's how we've approached it in Go Fair. And I'm happy to say more about that, but maybe that's enough for now.
I think that's fantastic. Thanks, Eric. And I know there's quite a lot more to say. And I really appreciate how you've what are your choices, knowing full well that our community is evolving as we speak, and those choices continue to change and get better, hopefully get better. And that, we can only do what we can do with what we have right now. And, what does that mean? Yeah.
So, by high demand from doing workshops with communities, we saw very clearly people wanted an option for answering, this is the resource I'm using now, but we have a project and we want to implement this later. So, we use XML now to describe things, but we have a project and we're going to shift everything to RDF. So, next year we can do everything in RDF. And so we actually built into the tooling that we have for this, the capability for people to say what they do now and what they might be interested in implementing later on. So when we begin to accumulate these profiles together, we actually can begin to get a kind of a technology trend, and we can see how groups are envisioning their fairness in the future.
Oh, now that's cool.
Yeah, so that's cool. Another, but that was really, that was an empirical discovery. People just were asking for this. So we tried to accommodate it.
That's really cool. Eliona, I'm not sure I'm saying your first name right. Let me make sure of that first.
Yes, hi, thanks, Shelly. My name is Ilona, but I'm fine with anything that sounds a little bit similar like that. Yeah, so thanks for your reply, Eric. And I also wanted to jump into that, or actually second what you're saying, in the sense that I think we've went over the last couple of years from the principles to the indicators to metrics, but then I think now there is the moment for us to develop practical tests against the metrics. But also what I think is very important, that I hope that's also your point, that it's not only about tests or evaluation, but it's really about also commonly identifying like action points. What can you do to improve the data, for example? So this consultancy step is also very important for me. Yeah, and also actually for the European Open Science Cloud Task Force perspective, because yeah, this is what I'm representing here. I'm also working in Fair, by the way, but I now just take the task force perspective, because one of the aims we have in our task force is to oversee the implementation of the FAIR metrics for the EOSC, for the European Open Science Cloud. And I think we really should support the assessment and the tests of those metrics and practical tests within communities. So I think we really should support the disciplinary communities and also see if these tests are fit for purpose for the respective communities. So this is something I think for the way forward.
Fantastic, thank you. And Rob, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I can reflect a little bit on the stories that Keith actually told, and maybe funny, but it is an experience that actually Eric had firsthand. But I'll tell you the story. So we've conducted some workshops where, like Keith, we did an evaluation of a self-evaluation actually by people of the FAIR principles for their own data. So we told people, think of your own data set, bring your own data set. And at this workshop, the first thing we do is we walk along the 15 principles and we make a self-assessment. How far are we along these principles? Then we have 24 hours of hacking with experts on FAIR data present. Let's try and do the easiest things to make this data more fair. And then at the end, you do another evaluation, self-evaluation. Surprise, surprise, what happens? The second evaluation is worse than the first. Why? If you realize it's not so difficult to understand why this happens. What happens is actually working with their own data makes people realize how bad it is along the FAIR dimensions. And they can do some of their best to improve it during the workshop, during a 24-hour workshop. But at the end, they realize that there is still a lot more work to do. And this is really interesting also to see, and this is really my opinion about the FAIR metrics. FAIR metrics or a maturity model, they're very useful. But I am very much against them being used as a universal measuring tool that is going to be used as a cutoff, saying, okay, you need to be 55% along this metric. If you're 54%, you're out. If you're 56, your data set can be part of the EOSC. There is no way to make this a universal metric that is suitable for every data set. Every data set has its own demands. And actually, if you go along the evaluation of this kind of a model in my ideal way, then at every step you make the evaluation, how much effort is it for me to be more compliant? And what is the value for me and the value for science for doing that? And is it worth the investment? So a researcher may say, okay, this is too complicated for me at this moment. I am not going to see any benefit from it. I'm not doing this right now. And a research infrastructure observing this decision for a particular FAIR principle or for a maturity indicator can say, hey, wait, apparently this is hard. Maybe we can make a service to make it easier.
There we go.
That is the way I see these maturity indicators to be used.
I do appreciate that, and I also reflect. So Keith and Edith and I have also been very cautious about that cutoff concept. We don't want that type of use for any of our assessments for the model itself. This is really a journey, as you talked about, and your reflection on how we think our data is better than it truly is. So Fran, I'm gonna come back to you in just a second. I'm letting you know, and Fran, what I'm gonna give you a second to think about it while we go to Robert. But the question I'm gonna ask you is about interoperability and the USGS. And that when you were looking through the elements within FAIR, I noticed that those were still challenges. So that will be my question. I'm just giving you a chance to think about it. And so Robert, I'm coming over to you, following off of Rob. And if you would, there you are. I lost your face, but I see it now. And so if you would like to follow in on the conversation about the larger ecosystem in FAIR.
Yeah, so I think I would, maybe I can jump in where Ilona stopped a little bit when she said, we have the principles and we have the metrics and we have the tests now. So I think what we learned in FAIR's FAIR while we were trying to define the test was that it is not yet really well defined what the individual, foundations of the FAIR principles are. For example, the easiest or simplest thing is what actually is a persistent identifier. Who defines what a persistent identifier is? Who has defined what rich metadata is, and stuff like that. So we have a lot of literature around, and but still it is weakly defined. And what we see now, once we have the Fuji evaluator online, that people are approaching me and our team and asking for inclusion of distinct types of identifiers, which they think they are persistent identifiers, and well, which aren't. So this is, yeah, it is, or which are not really well following, for example, the EOSC PID policy. So which makes it difficult to include these in the test. So this is, I think, something we really need to work on. The definition of tests and the scientific foundation and rationale for these tests has to be agreed on. We tried this in the paper I posted here, so where we at least tried to justify how we performed our tests in Fuji. But this is, of course, the beginning of a probably a longer process where, well, all of the well, participants here and the whole community who is working on FAIR should jump in and well, and start the discussion on what the meaning, the deeper meaning of the FAIR principle actually is.
Yeah, and connecting through our conversation that it does not rest on the shoulders of the researcher alone, that it really is the entire process of research, the tools we use, the services, the infrastructure, and going back to something that Eric said about what is, and Ilona said about what is possible right now, and what the technology journey will be. Eric, so Fran, hold tight. I'll come back to interoperability. So Eric, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. And this issue of community is actually something that kind of was a bit of a surprise to me in the FAIR implementation profile approach. And I've come to really now appreciate the value of this idea of a domain community or a community of practice in defining FAIR implementations and standards for themselves. And so to come to Robert's question, like how, what constitutes FAIR metadata? The way we were working with this in the FAIR metrics papers and the FAIR maturity paper was that, this was a question for the domain community. So it's up to them to decide what they mean by FAIR. But to really try and push everything to a machine actionable level, what that means is that has to be described somehow and registered or recorded in a way that could eventually, we could imagine, be validated in some automated way. So it's nice to be very explicit about your community standards. And what we see in the FAIR implementation profile approach was that we could really stimulate in communities that had not thought very deeply about these things, kind of step by step through the principles. Okay, what would constitute FAIR metadata or rich metadata, in principle F2, or what's kind of provenance metadata do we think is important for our community? And I don't know if this is yet to be done. We could have probably achieved it even a year ago, but because we have communities that have completed their FAIR implementation profile, they've made some choices here. In some cases, difficult choices, but they've made them. We could imagine then that this would allow a maturity evaluator tool to build tests for that community now. So by being explicit in the FAIR implementation profile and saying, this is our metadata schema, this is what we think is minimally important and should be there, and these are the vocabularies we use, it would now be possible to build an evaluation tool and an evaluation test for that community. And so what we can imagine is kind of this exploding library of community standards declared, by these groups to do this. Maybe one other kind of interesting element to this. The word community also kind of generates a little bit of angst when people are creating a profile because they don't want to get it wrong. Right? They say, well, who am I representing exactly? How big is my community? Do I have to check with all the members of this community before we can say what's going on? So clearly there needs to be a process in place by which communities can make these collective decisions. And I think we've kind of flagged that, which is nice. But really at the logical level, I think I've come to the conclusion myself that in a way, in FAIR, community can be represented at this list of technology choices, or the architectures you use to implement FAIR, such that a traditional domain community, like geosciences and another traditional domain community in the life sciences, if they were to use the same FAIR implementation profile, from the FAIR point of view, they might actually be the same community. And pushing it to a kind of an extreme, but the point is that the list of choices you make is an indication of how this group has decided to go FAIR. And there's then the next step of negotiating. Is that a good set of choices? Could it be made better, etc. But then you at least set up a very clear ecosystem of communities and very explicit implementation choices that they can then kind of logically try to harmonize.
Yep. Similarities and differences, less domain and data type, but more technology decisions. And that's really, really interesting. Francoise, I'm curious as to what your question is.
I would like to bring another example, which has to do with a community and with big infrastructures. We got the example at the RDA France annual meeting a few weeks ago, and I think it's good to share it with you because it's another piece of the global ecosystem. So these people, they have a big project funded by the European Commission to deal with photon and neutron facilities. So the project is called PANOSC, Photon Neutron Open Science Cloud. And they have used the FAIR data maturity model to check what they were establishing as a data policy framework for the infrastructure. So they gave a report on that at our RDA France meeting, and they say it was really useful. They started from evaluating what happens at the facilities, but they were trying to establish shared data policies for the infrastructures of the domain. So it has to do with the domain aspects. And it's another possible usage of a FAIR data maturity model.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Robert, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I would like to just to mention that I think it is really, or we should be cautious when we talk about communities in context with FAIR, because this may lead to little FAIR islands within the big lake of scientific data. And as we have learned during the last decades, in particular in the geosciences, it is really crazy what kind of methodologies people are using and what kind of data they need to compare and to perform their scientific analysis. I mean, no one could have thought about geoscientists using a large amount of oceanographic data 60, 70 years before. Now this is daily use, and people are starting to use, genomics and other data within their research, even from scientific domains which never spoke about this years ago. So if we talk about FAIR, I think we should have to keep in mind the interdisciplinarity, and that we should think about the scientific community or scientific domain as a ecosystem of all domains rather than isolated demands. So this is just and that was the reason why we started in FAIR's FAIR with domain agnostic FAIR indicators rather than domain specific.
Robert, that is the perfect segue over to Fran. And so we know that cross-domain work is some of the hardest work to understand, to have common common ways of looking at metadata. You know, if I, an oceanographer, prepare my data for my own community, for my own oceanographic community, how can climate science use this? How can you know, health use it? You know, because that it all impacts. So, Fran, I've given you a chance to think about interoperability. I know it's one of the hardest topics, and could you share what USGS is thinking about your data stores, how you're thinking about interoperability, and what are those steps that you're thinking about taking?
I would say that we're focusing on the easy part, which is technical, which is where you find data, how you read it, how you put it together, what part of the metadata you look in to find out what this data really is. But we really need to be, for the semantic interoperability, we really need to be working toward a use case.
Yeah.
And we will probably be continually improving our data to be interoperable with more different sources of data for more different purposes. But really, the technical interoperability to just allow people to read our data and do bad science with it is the low-hanging fruit, which we like to talk about in USGS, low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's realistic. I think that's realistic. There's a community that's been actually working with USGS. That's part of the National Institutes for Health. They're the folks that deal with environmental disasters, like the Superfund folks that go back in to clean up the soil, that go in to clean up what's happened in a particular area. And they have been diving into the concepts around interoperability, and they are uniquely positioned to bring in very different types of data in order to solve these problems. But it truly requires a use case. Like you know, to the humorous, you know, you can't boil the ocean. Okay, Fran, you laughed. But you can't make all data useful for all research. You have to have an actual example. And I think that does make sense. And is we probably need to be able to understand our data first and then work towards interoperability. I think that's what you're talking about with low-hanging fruit, Fran, something along those lines. Ilona, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. So yeah, I both actually support what Robert is saying, but as well, Shelley and Fran, about the use cases. And I'm taking here the European Open Science Cloud Task Force perspective. So then I think, yes, we should be at first like domain agnostic and serve as broad of a community as possible. But then also what I would like to do in the task force is then also, yes, to pick up on some use cases, but then not address the use cases like this only, but really also focus on the lessons learned and the commonalities and the challenges between those use cases. And that, I think, is the only way to move forward in this respect. So I support Robert as well as what friends say.
Yeah, and that hits on something that Eric was talking about, where there are patterns. So, you know, you would never say to one researcher, gosh, you know, what you've decided on looks an awful lot like these other people, which you tend to not talk to. You know, you realize that that's probably not how to proceed, because everyone wants to feel uniquely acknowledged, uniquely positioned, but yet we have an opportunity to see patterns with data fairness verification that we've never seen before, because we've not been able to examine the data the way Eric's been talking about it, how these patterns are showing up, how that journey is there. I'm sorry, I'm really excited about that concept. Let's see. All right, so let us head back, and Keith, I've given you a step out because I realize it's like 3 a.m. for you. Did you want to add into the conversation before we move on?
No, I'm frantically trying to capture notes. There's a lot coming up. It's really interesting. I'm really enjoying this, even though it's 3 a.m. No, it's really fun and very interesting to see similar messages coming up. I do also like that I find it do you see the challenge and the question marks around discipline and discipline specific versus commonalities, and how do you balance that out and how do you connect that up? And yeah, hearing this coming out in different groups and different presentations, it's very interesting. Sorry.
So let me head down that path, because this is an area that AGU is looking at. Eric and I have talked about what does it mean for the geosciences to have a fair implementation plan. And you and I will have to have a conversation later, Eric, because we actually have made some progress, and your thoughts on it will be valuable. But I want to head over to what Rob and Robert have talked about, and everyone also. Let's not make a fair island. And what I mean by fair island, I know there's a project called Fair Island that's actually working really nicely. So I don't mean that. What I mean is we have to be inclusive no matter where our researchers are on this journey, including having not yet understood what fair means. Like, we have to be able to put our arms around all of them. And what does it mean to help a community take steps forward, knowing that we're starting, we have our assessment methodology, right? So let's take these concepts of, I think Eric put it out there, and we've also seen it with Fuji. What if we took the Fuji tool, tuned it to one of Eric's implementation plan methodologies? Let's take, I think you've got Chin, right? You've got the chemical folks. Is anybody here in the Chin group? Just put your hand up or something. So what if we tuned Fuji to Chin? So the chemical implementation network and their plan. And I don't even know if they've built one yet. I'm just going to pretend they have. And how would you see that moving forward to pull in a meaningful way that community, such that we're not saying, if your data didn't pass the Chin assessment tool, you're out, right? Like, on the island, everybody's on the island, not off. So we'd really have to do this very delicately. This would have to be really coordinated across a broad community, that this is a journey tool, that this is how you begin the journey, and anywhere on the journey is okay. Like, that would be, this thinking. And Keith, I feel like I might be a tiny bit on the edge of the topic of our session today, but I'm really curious about a domain path. Like, how would a domain path take assessment? How would we, so Robert, you've got Fuji and you've worked with actual teams. Have you run into any thinking on a domain specific angle?
So from my experience, and I learned a lot during the last months, because I was approached by various disciplines and a lot of archives. And so based on this, I think, for most, let's tell them data archives or data repositories, all of them have a strong interest to share the data with the scientific community in general. And to reach this, they of course have a strong interest to make their data findable, and in particular findable for the community as well as major search engines. And this is a huge momentum what we see in the moment. The publication of the schema.org dataset profile, which also led to the development of the Google dataset search, is something which led to the improved findability of hundreds, thousands, and millions of datasets now. And this profile, or such domain agnostic profiles, are quite easy to be implemented by all domains. So this is, as Fran said before, really a quite low-hanging fruit to achieve. And if you are on Google, right, you basically passed the first 50% of your fair journey already. So
you mean F&A, right?
Yes.
Which is as we know, gosh, who had it the other day? It's 20% PIDs and 80% metadata. I forget which talk was that. Somebody had that the other day. So it's not really 50%, but it is the lowest hanging fruit.
In terms of number of letters in FAIR, it's 50.
Okay, fair enough.
But of
but
course, yeah.
You're making a really important argument, because what you're saying to the researcher is your work could be discoverable in a different way if you pay attention to these two letters. And that is very motivating. And I think if we continue to work on what does it mean to the researcher, I think it's really powerful. And I'm hoping Rob's heading in this direction. It's really powerful to say to the researcher, if you join your domain community on the elements around interoperability and reuse, you're richly rewarded, because now you have access, easy access to this body of knowledge where you've just contributed. Like, I really feel like that value statement is so powerful and feeds into concepts around open science and working openly. Okay, Rob, carry it on.
I think I'm orthogonal to this. I find this a really interesting perspective to say, okay, the first steps that you have to make are with your community, because the community is so important. In my experience, it's a bit different. I think many of the first steps that people can take are domain agnostic. And in principle, if you look at the FAIR data maturity model, of course, we have, 43 different steps. It should make the elephant more edible to novices. The only problem is it's not understandable for novices. So I have a few slides that I regularly present to groups of life scientists. And I try to translate them into their own words for their subgroup. So that's the word, but there are the same things. So maybe they have another name or for a persistent identifier, or they have a different example of a persistent identifier in their group, which I try to mention. But indeed, for everyone, persistent identifiers are the easiest step. And a lot of people are suffering, saying, okay, how do I make my data findable? Until they're just told about the fact that this problem is universal, and that people have made services for that called repositories. And that it's much easier for you in general to put the data in a repository than to maintain it for 15 years on your own website. These are eye-opening to a lot of people that are for the first time exposed to FAIR, and it's discipline unspecific.
So first of all, the edible elephant, I think, is going to be the name of the new blog post that we're going to start. I think that's brilliant. And you know, yes, walking in that path makes a lot of sense. So Lindsay remembered exactly where the 80% and 20% came from. Eva Mendez gave a talk from FAIR is Fair about metadata for the Society Data Sharing Series last Friday. And that was the Elephant Gourmet. Thank you, Eric. That is fantastic. So low-hanging fruit. So let's talk about domain agnostic, low-hanging fruit. I'm going to go back to our speakers. So Keith and Fran. Fran, you talked about those easy answers as well. So I'll get, since it's 3 a.m. for Keith, we'll let him go second. So there is a lot to be said about making progress quickly and being able to get researchers engaged with that low-hanging fruit. But I'm going to ask you a really straight up question. I don't think we've got PIDs on everything yet. I think we still actually have, yeah, there, look at that face. We still have quite a lot of work around the concept of actual assignment of persistent identifiers, data granularity. Thank goodness we have a new working group in RDA on this, figuring out data granularity and how to do that. Can you talk to that low-hanging fruit a little bit more, Fran?
Speaking of PIDs, the low-hanging fruit in USGS has been to have Viv Hutchison's team, which makes tools that do the job well and are easier for the researchers to use. So that's how we have gone into the PIDs for metadata records in a year. We had to meet a deadline, and they gave us a tool and we did it. There was some need for flexibility. Some people had to have their own tools. That's okay. But I would say that the tool shops that are in touch with the researchers and also with the requirements is a low-hanging fruit orchard.
That is brilliant. So I'm gonna carefully restate what you just said, and Fran, you can nix it, but USGS is a funder, and USGS has policy about what is allowed to happen within research as a funder. And you're essentially stating that it matters within your community that these tools have capabilities that support researchers that allow FAIR to be easier to provide. And that matters. It matters that you took that statement. It matters that you require those tools and services to be FAIR aligned. We'll say FAIR aligned because they're probably not fully compliant, but they're FAIR aligned. Yeah. Should I retract anything that I just said, or is that okay?
One bit of easy misunderstanding is that USGS isn't just a funder, it's our supervisor. So they can actually not only say, we'll fund your project if you'll do this, they'll say, you're not working unless we fund your project. And that's got some strength to it.
Yeah. So it's not only outside external researchers, but also internal researchers. And the fact that Viv understands this goal and the value it will have to research. So huge kudos, first of all, to Viv Hutchinson, who we all see as a real forward-leaning leader within USGS, but also across US government, and has been helping with the federal data strategy as well. So I'm just, highlighting her contribution. She spoke yesterday. So thank you, Viv. And Keith, please, ARDC, also a leader and part of the government entity.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I've noticed is that working with these fellow research infrastructure facilities that are usually provide facilities in specific domains and disciplines is really helpful, because they provide the groundwork and the basis for a lot of researchers to do their research. So they are the ones that provide the analysis tools and the instruments and spit out the data for the researchers to use, etc. So if you can start early on in that process and engage them in providing more FAIR ready data, that's a starting point. Look, there's still not a guarantee that the researcher will then pick it up and actually make it FAIR at the end, but it does make it an awful lot easier. So you've got FAIR prepared data at least, and these organizations, they're usually not in a position to dictate to a researcher what they should be doing with the data, but they can at least inform them and can start educating them. And if they can provide, for example, associated metadata and provenance information alongside the data, and with a bit of instruction to the researcher saying, don't throw this away, this is actually useful, and actually keep this alongside your data. Those are stepping stones and pieces that will make it easier for the researcher down the track to make the data FAIR. So that's one of the pieces of the puzzle we've been working on.
Okay, so we have, I believe, 15 minutes left in our session. So what I'd really like to do is turn essentially our final question to our roundtable, but also to the entire community here online. And this question, so Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group, we would like to hear back from you on what would be, and if you've more than one thing, you're certainly welcome to share that, but one thing that, as we are considering the next version of the model, which we have every intention of evolving it based on your feedback, what would be something we would need to address? So it's the last bullet on your notes, something that might be missing from your implementation where the model could be helpful for dealing with obstacles or constraints in order to support you. So it's a particular way of looking at the model as you're using it for your own assessment methodology, for your own communities. How could the model help you if we were to address something that is missing? So I think I've said that enough times. And Andreas, you know you're going first.
And so, Shelley, just one comment before you start asking people. Please also put things in the notes document. So as you're listening to this discussion, if you have perspectives, please just throw them in there too. It's under bullet points. And that will enable us to capture a bit more than we might be able to cover in the time. So, and that goes for everybody. So not just roundtable participants, but everybody. So thank you. Sorry.
Thanks, Keith. That's, yes. All right, Andreas, your brilliant thought. What is the missing piece?
It's wonderful to see that fair data principles and maturity model is working well. And if the evolution is going to not only to focus on data itself, so beyond the data, that would be very great. That would be a hard job or hard challenge to do this. And that's from my side shortly.
And actually, I think you answered one of Carlos's questions in the chat earlier, which I was sidestepping a little bit because we had a discussion as to exactly how to frame this particular working group, but didn't want to miss the fact that Carlos was asking, well, don't you think we need a maturity model for software as well, or for any digital object? So Andreas, thanks for that. That might be actually super helpful. And I know there is work happening that we could certainly collaborate with on that. Thank you. Okay, so Eric, what is missing?
So Shelley, just so I can understand the question, so what's missing from the maturity model? Is it?
Yes, so I'll frame it again to give you a second to think. So, you know, we look at FAIR and its richness of idea, but yet the depth really depends on the implementation. The model is based off of FAIR very directly. We did not waver. It was a scoping decision when we built the FAIR data maturity model to stick to FAIR exactly. So when we come out with the next version of the model, what about implementing FAIR assessment would benefit from a change in the model or enhancement in the model to help with you or any other challenge you're running into?
Yeah, so for me, that's a simple answer. In the next iteration, I think it would be great to see some system in place by which we could register really like domain level decision making, or these are agreed upon standards for a community, and that community would itself be well defined, would have an identifier. We would know who that community is, and may not necessarily be an easy task, but for me, that's the most essential thing to move forward, is really kind of being able to, in very explicit terms, identify domain relevant community standards, R 1.3.
I love it. I love it. That's fantastic. That's really fantastic. That'll give us something to do for quite some time. Fran, you've grappled with the model.
What I would like to see in the model, and this is a harder thing than the current model, but not to evaluate an object, but to evaluate data as received from a system.
Oh, like as a workflow is working through and you've received it out of a system or service, how fair is it?
How fair is it? Does that system provide the FAIR vocabularies that are needed to understand it? Does that system
Oh, I really love that. So, somebody must be working on this. So not a thing, but the mechanism we're using to do research. How fair is the mechanism? And this goes to, Eric, what you've been talking about, the choices within the implementation plans, like what the technical, you didn't say stack, but the choices that were made, how fair they are. It's
Yeah.
in the same space.
Yeah, so there's the what composes this fair implementation profile. We call it a fair enabling resource. That's what we're looking for as an answer in this questionnaire. So that's pretty straightforward. We're looking for a referenceable piece of technology. There may be issues at the architectural level. So how are these components put together? DOIs do not, depending on how a DOI is implemented, can give you various levels of fairness at the other end. So it also depends on kind of this, the way you architect and the way you are deploying a technology. That's going to be, I think, more tricky to kind of measure. And I don't know if it's even going to be easy in the near time frames to do something like that. But for now, it's really kind of listing your fair enabling resource. But as an example, vocabularies, in Principle Principle I2 is asking for the fact that your vocabularies are themselves fair. So this is an example where you could score the fairness of your fair enabling resource like a vocabulary. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We can begin to actually have a fair implementation profile with a bunch of fair scores for each of those referenceable fair implementation or fair enabling resources.
And it helps us avoid the problem of a researcher feeling like they're being judged. It takes it off of a person and puts it into a system, which is a lot easier to talk about and improve. Oh, I really, really love this idea.
So we have a tool that allows you to create fair implementation profiles using nano publications. So we were trying to get as close as we could to our FIPS as being themselves fair. Right? We're really trying to push that way. So indeed, your the fair enabling resources in your fair implementation profile can be scored that way. But really what I want to say is unless you are a community of one, those choices in a fair implementation profile are always reflecting your community.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a big community. It could, but bigger communities tend to move slower and more cautiously. Smaller communities are happy to just kind of agilely move and build things. So, so indeed, it's
interesting. So we have 5 minutes left and 3 more folks, and Keith, I'm skipping you since you and I have to implement. So Ilona, your idea on what is missing?
Yes, this is starting very interesting for me as well, because I also like the point of fair enabling. So how do, for example, services support the provision of fair data? I always like to take the fair enabling perspective, for example, for repositories, and don't label them as fair because you don't really measure them against some agreed metrics or something like that. And also that's something that I'm not sure if this is intrinsically missing from the fair data maturity model, but I think indeed what Fran also said, so the relation for the fair over time, and then the role of wider infrastructure in this, and probably also the assessment of wider infrastructure, these alignment works need to be done in my view, because yes, fair is important. So it's, in my view, it's like a snapshot in time, but how do you preserve the data over time? So this is an angle I would like to explore further.
Very interesting. Yes, thank you. And Rob, you are up next.
Yeah, so I can be quick because this is exactly the point that I wanted to raise, that in my words, the fair data maturity model only works for existing data. So once it's published out there, then we can measure how fair it is. So how well we did. And then we need to do something again if we want to make it better. And it would be much better if we could evaluate something beforehand. And this is actually so for fair by design, that we start delivering fair data as close to the source as possible. And this is during the whole process of the development of the fair data maturity model, this has been my viewpoint. I am sitting in front of a poster for a data management planning tool that guides people towards choices that make your data more fair at the end. And it is more difficult because it is not 15-dimensional, but you can do way more, make way more choices there. And I don't know how we could classify it, but it would be very, very useful to actually make that systematic.
And that's the wizard, right? Isn't that's what I'm seeing? Okay, yes, very good. And Robert, you get to tell us everything that we missed.
So I'm going definitely I'm not be able to tell you everything about what's missing, but a little bit on well, what you could add to support automated testing. And this is in particular more information about the background of well, each metric, the scientific background. So for example, this F2 metric about rich metadata, I think it would be good to add some references what this means. And this is actually a good a starting point, for example, to here enable also communities to extend it. I think what you can do from the RDA perspective on, you only can define well a first domain agnostic level for example what rich metadata means. But for other communities, and this is, I think, what Françoise wanted to mention in her comments. So for some communities, a more metadata might be important for the community to make it really discoverable. And well, this is where the RDA probably can't help anymore. But so for the domain agnostic FAIR approach, I think more specifics in terms of references to papers and documents and standards would be very helpful.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And thank you everyone who's added additional comments within the chat. We will definitely take a look at those as well. And within the notes, we have come down to the bottom of our time. This has been a really exciting session. Thank you all for your thoughts and contributions. And I know we'll continue to work together going forward. And if anything else comes up and you want to shoot a note over to Keith and Edith and I, we're more than happy to add that in and continue to work on what it means to help our community move the concepts around FAIR further with the piece of the puzzle that we're working on. So thank you all. Fran, thank you so much for contributing. This has been incredibly useful to have you here. And Keith, also ARDC, thank you. So the two hats you have on today. I'm so grateful. And all of the members of the roundtable and everyone else contributing, thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you.